when you picture something in World War I, what comes to mind? Just not you, Frank, because everything comes to mind to you. You know I don't know it all. Huh? Maggie?
I know that someone important was shot, and I remember that I know very little else, and I know that a friend's father fought in it, and I know that my father read avidly history and knew all about it.
Okay, and well, that's okay. And I was talking to somebody just like last week, and we were talking about World War I, and this person said, I just couldn't believe that a whole war that involved the world was started because some little old guy somewhere was shot. And I thought, well, yeah, that technically is an answer, but there's so much more than that. And Ned, John, you had an answer to my question too. What you think about when you think of World War I? The trenches, okay. So I looked a little bit about them. Now, there's going to be a whole lesson on trenches. I will tell you the professor that you'll hear is not Dr. Fears. I know many of you are used to him. This guy's just as good, just different. He doesn't have he has very little of the humor that Dr. Fears had. So I've entitled this Tidbits, and I hope you will like what you will be hearing. I had thought somebody might comment about the hats that are in the pictures. This is called a pickelhaube. Yeah, I in a pickle. Oh no! So you were laughing at my German, weren't you? A pickelhaube, which means pickaxe hat, and they were made of leather. They were kept shiny and bright. The insignia for their regiment was on it, and it made a perfect aim for the enemy. So they could see the little sticks up there, they could see the bright shiny stuff, and the enemy guys aimed for that hat. It originated in 1850 in Prussia and kind of caught on around several different armies. Eventually, they ran out of the leather during the war, so they made these helmets out of pressed felt. Now, if some of my sewers in here may know that felt is not really, wouldn't stop a bullet. I don't care how pressed it was, or it would leave somebody really depressed. Thank you. And then the guys in the trenches started painting their helmets. They went from the pressed felt to cardboard and eventually got to a real thin metal that they made the helmets out of. And while this is really nice, the guys couldn't hear, so it had its own problems. And eventually they went away with, well, you can see here, they went away with the thing on the top. And it was only, those helmets were only used for dress parades. With the cockades at the top, you've seen pictures that had the little feathery things. Actually, those little feathery things were made of horse tails. Hope that's your final Jeopardy question. This summer when we were at the museum at Paris Island, I had no idea that the U.S. Marines would have been wearing a pickelhaube. But they too had these about the same time, the late 1800s. They did away with it in 1904, but they were mostly used with the white dress uniforms by the officers and the enlisted men. So now that you know everything about pickelhaubers, sometimes they were called pickle helms, but you get the idea. So that's something that came to me about World War I. I'm going to change to my second little tidbit now and talk about, oh, I just hit a button there. Okay, volume. Talk about the relationships between England and Germany at the time. Queen Victoria had been Kaiser Wilhelm the second, Kaiser Wilhelm II's grandmother. Her sons, Henry VII, wasn't Henry, her sons, Edward VII and grandson George V, often came over to Germany and they would visit with the Kaiser when he was younger, before he was Kaiser. So there was a big relationship there. Lots of Germans, in this picture, the time frame of before the war and even like 1860, 50, 60, 70, a lot of Germans went to England to find jobs, and they stayed there. They raised their children there, but their children were of German heritage, so they were German citizens, even though they had been born in England. It happened that when the war broke out, some of these young men went over to Germany to fight for Germany, having never stepped foot on German soil. It happened, too, that while they had been married, they had businesses, they lived in a neighborhood, they had friends, were part of a village. When the war got really down and dirty and had lasted for some time, they thought it was going to be a real quick one. When it got to keeping on, their neighbors kind of turned against them. So that drove some of these young men on back to Germany. Some of the German men who were married to British women were put in intern camps. That's not what's the word? They were interred in camps. Interned, not interred. So it was a real hard time for all these people. And the same thing actually happened in Germany. In Germany, we had British people there that were studying, and they had married and lived there. But the same kinds of things happened to them. And it was one of the things that kept the relationship going, had started the relationship. The Germans had a reputation for being very good business folk. So young men in Britain that wanted to get into business would go to Germany to study. They would go to learn a language that had to do with trade, finance, and business. They went to the universities there. The Germans that came to, and this will come out in one of my little stories, the Germans that came to Britain found all kinds of jobs that they liked. They were really big in the hotel and restaurant business. And they felt at home, they enjoyed themselves, and that was kind of like pre-war England and Germany, and had the shaking hands, that they were friendly. I can't show this one at the end because it wasn't quite true. My next little tidbit, and I love this story. Captain Campbell had been taken prisoner early in 1914, early in the war. He had been held for 2 years at Magdeburg, a well-known prison of war camp. He got notice, he had a letter from his sister saying that their mother was dying. He wanted to go home. He hadn't been home in 2 years. He'd been in the camp. There wasn't much he could do. So he went to the warden, and I got really tickled because what came to my mind then was Hogan's Heroes. You know, we've got this little captain here in the prison of war camp, and evidently knows of the commandant, Colonel Klink. Is that his name? So Captain Campbell goes to Colonel Klink and tells him his sob story. And the colonel said, well, you know what? Write a letter. Write a letter to the Kaiser, and I will see that it gets up through the chain of command to the Kaiser. Well, he did write the letter. It did get to the Kaiser, and he not only said, yeah, sure, you can go, but made arrangements for him to get, or one of his men, made his arrangements to get out of the POW camp, travel through Holland to a ship going to England, and he got home to see his mother. The catch was, he had only 2 weeks to do this. So at the end of 2 weeks, he kept his word of honor and came back to the POW camp. The British thought, oh, that's a nice idea. Why don't we try that too? So I don't know how they found the right German prisoner or something, what was happening in his family, what the circumstances were, but the British let the German guy go, gave him transportation, and guess what? He didn't come back. He stayed. So that was the end of that program, but it was a nice goodwill gesture that probably would not have happened further on during the war when things got kind of bad. You asked about trenches. There was more than one trench on the line. Of course, these trenches went from Switzerland to the North Sea. They didn't initially, but they started against each other, and then they would try to outflank somebody, and then they've got trenches all the way. There are, let's see, this is just one. Okay, we've got other people over here, but this is just one set of one side's trench. This is the no man's land. You notice all the pock marks. We've got a guy up here, and I don't know if he's watching his troops. It's a German plane. If he's watching his troops to see what's going on, or if he's taking pictures of who's got what where. And there's going to be much more of this in depth, but the trench thing came up. Okay, and you've got the front line trenches, and that's what you usually hear about, because that's where the fighting took place. But then back here, you've got the support guys. They had to have places, a way to get ammo up to the front, to get people up to the front, to get meals up to the front. So that's the second line here. Notice the little concrete block for the machine guns. That was later on in the war. That was a newish kind of thing. And back here was the reserve trenches. When the guys had their couple of days in the front, they could ferry back to the back and have their replacements there. They weren't there for weeks and weeks at a time on the front lines. They were there long enough, and they got tired of it, of course, but there were breaks. And I'm not going to read all this. Y'all probably already have. I just will leave you with the idea that you're going to get much more about the trenches from the professor. You have probably heard about the Christmas truce of 1914. I think, again, another tidbit that's fascinating. They had been kind of warned about maybe something happening on Christmas or New Year's, the soldiers had, but they weren't ready for what really did happen. In fact, I'm going to read from a soldier's point of view what happened that day. The day started, Christmas Eve started like any other morning. The British or the Germans, one of them would start a barrage of artillery in the morning, just to let them know that they were awake. And the other side, after they finished, would send a barrage of artillery shells over to their trench to know that they were awake too. They were ready to start their day. During the night, there might have been people sent over the top to go cut barbed wire, to see what they could find out by being up closer to the enemy, maybe listen. That usually wasn't successful for the person that went out. But usually their nights were spent, if somebody had been killed in no man's land, the land between the two sides, at night they would send burial details out to retrieve that soldier, and both sides would do that, of course. And sometimes these burial details would talk to each other. So many of the Germans had been in England, and they knew English, so they would talk to each other. It's just kind of an interesting tale, and maybe that sets the stage for how this worked out. But this is written by Private Frank Sumter of the 1st Rifle Brigade. And he writes, this is a letter home to his family. We heard the Germans singing Silent Night, Holy Night, and then they put up a notice, Merry Christmas. Then they started singing, and our boys said, we'll join in. So we joined in, and with the song, we all started singing. They stopped. So we sang on, and then we stopped, and they sang. The Germans waved their hands. Happy Noel, Tommy. One German took a chance and jumped up on top of the trench and shouted, "Happy Christmas, Tommy!" No one fired a shot, which was marvelous, as before then you couldn't put your finger up without it being blown off. Of course, our boys said, "If he can do it, we can do it." The sergeant major came along and said, "Get down there, get down there." We stuck out our 2 fingers at him and jumped up. "It's Christmas." The Germans beckoned us forward to the barbed wire and we shook hands. I spoke to one German and he said, "Do you know Islington?" He could speak very good English. "Do you know the Jolly Farmers Pub in Southgate Road?" And I said, "Yes. My uncle has a shoe repairing shop next door." And he said, "That's funny. There's a barber shop on the corner, and I used to work there before the war." He must have shaved my uncle at times, and yet my bullet might have found him, and his me. I thought that was just the nicest way to kind of describe what started. Once they got out of the trenches in different places, they did different things. It sounds like in this instance, at that place, it was speaking, talking, laughing. Somebody pulled maybe a harmonica out and they would dance. In other places, they had soccer tournaments. Just had a good time, and here they are just around the Christmas tree. It was a nice time. They swapped, let me find they swapped, okay, here we go. This bully beef tin down here was the rations for the British Army. The Germans didn't have that, something they wanted it. Evidently, they had heard about it and it sounded good. So they swapped that. They swapped belt buckles, patches, anything that, as a souvenir type thing. One of the Germans took some British soldiers into their trench. And these guys were smart enough to note where the snipers were. And when they came back to their side, they could map out generally where those snipers were, and that was a big help because they were very hard to pinpoint. Okay. Oh, the letters home made the newspapers, the German ones and the British ones. And these people putting on this war, the generals didn't care for this a whole lot. Thought maybe we need more control over our soldiers. That's not what we're trying to portray. Now, the private's letter I wrote about, he was telling about what had happened with the everyday soldier that they accomplished. The Pope had tried to reach out to the British leaders and the German leaders asking for a truce. They didn't accept it. Wouldn't talk to him about it, wouldn't go through with it. But these everyday soldiers got their pictures taken and got on the front page. Now, when this happened, everybody, all the higher-ups got really mad, and they banned cameras. The soldiers couldn't have cameras anymore on the fields. And they really started looking into the letters they were writing home. They had, I guess before, picked a few out to read, be sure that no secrets were going through. Now they were very much scrutinized because of this. But the happy part, all over England and Germany, they had this statue of the two sides shaking hands, and that's a soccer ball in the middle. The one at the bottom here is at Liverpool. This one, oh, I've got it backwards. This one's at Liverpool, and this one was in the salient of Ypres, that the war that happened right at the beginning of the World War. So I don't doubt that somewhere around, in your travels, you may have run into these. But I thought that was a magnificent way of enjoying that little bit of peace during wartime. All righty. How are we doing? Okay. Well, good. We're going to go into something else. I had another little tidbit, but I didn't know how this was going to work out. So, how many of y'all had heard of the Christmas truce? Okay, so it's not an unknown story at all. Okay. I've got one more little tidbit. And I tell you, I love this one. The trenches weren't just trenches for fighting and living. There was some underground things going on in that trench. And the way what happened, the Germans were digging tunnels. And one day, all this British was sitting in their happy little trench, and it blew up because the Germans had been tunneling under the trenches, planted some explosives, and the next thing they knew, they were not there. It scared the British hierarchy, and they decided they were going to have to do something about that. But they didn't have people that knew how to dig tunnels that were right there. So they went to a man who was a miner, and he got some of his men together and said, well, we can do that. And then there was a problem with different places. There was different stratigraphy under there, so it was hard to kind of plan what was going to happen, different kinds of soils. When they would dig, they had to worry about running into the Germans where they were digging. And you can see, let's start right here with the German trench. Theirs were closer to the top, and they used sandbags as tamping, all right, to get the stuff out and seal it. They were kind of loud when they worked, and the British figured out they could drive a stick into the soil. This is really funny. Hold it with their teeth, and they could feel the vibrations of the Germans digging. And I thought about, the Indians used to put their ears to the rails to find out when the train was coming. It's just a sensitivity. The British trenches, they dug deeper. The men that, let's see, his name was Hellfire Jack, who was hired to have the engineers come. I thought I had a picture of him. I didn't. The biggest explosion they had was felt in Paris and London. They dug and dug and dug and planted where they put the bombs. It was all out along the lines, and when they blew, they had it timed so they were about 3 seconds apart. And when it blew, it killed like 8,000 Germans on the trenches, and it was kind of the end of trench warfare. No, it wasn't the end. It was at a time when it went away because with new technology that was coming up, the trenches sort of petered out. Their use was gone. But the Messines Ridge is again at the Ypres, Belgium area. You can see the tunnels here and the counter tunnels. They would run into each other sometimes when they wanted there, and then it was kind of like hand-to-hand combat. The number of tunnelers, of course, some of them, the caves would fall in, and this larger one here, where the sound radius when it went off, and that really was truly a big deal. Yes.
Well,
yes.
Actually, the Big Gap Tunnel, that particular tunnel, they actually brought in equipment that was used to build the London subway. So, quite honestly, that was a major undertaking for that particular tunnel, but it didn't really cause the end of transport
Right. It started waning at that point.
But the fact of the matter is, this French warfare was continued on for a significantly long time, primarily due to the biggest, probably simple reason is communications improved. So basically, you could take artillery fire and actually get it where it needed to be, because people would use, for example, smaller size radios. The other issue, obviously, and what we look at in World War I French warfare would be obviously the development of the tank.
Right. But
Those two, I think those two issues were probably more important than mining and countermining.
okay, I was leaving that to the expert here. Yes, you're right. Another thing, Bill.
Related to that, didn't the Germans, I know in World War II, the Japanese would start booby trapping some of the caves, and I heard something that they worked out when the Germans would booby trap some of these trenches, so that when you dig down into them, there would be explosive devices that would go off and kill you. And they knew where they were, but the Allies didn't know where the booby traps were. And then finally we got wise and we started making our own booby traps, so that when in the trenches, you didn't know what the booby traps are, it's like landmines are now, you detonate them accidentally.
Yeah, and that they did detonate underground accidentally. That was a thing, and gas, carbon monoxide was a big problem. So there were a lot of problems underground that any tunnel anywhere would see. The British had what they call clay kicking, where they would lay on their back and dig, or they would lay down and dig, and they would kick this clay back, and it was much quieter to get the hole dug, get the refuse out of the way and out of the tunnel. The Germans used pickaxes, and that was one way they picked up on the sound of the Germans. One of the things too is, let's go back to the gas poisoning and the carbon monoxide underground. When they first started digging, they were afraid of the gas for their soldiers. So they would take canaries or mice with them that could smell the gas first. Of course, carbon monoxide has no odor, so they couldn't have smelled it. They didn't know it was there. But the canaries or the mice, and they found out that by the time the canaries died, that it was a little late for them too to get out. So they tried the mice, and the mice were the mice would slow down when they smelled the carbon monoxide or the gases under there. They would slow down, and that was a little hint, but they wanted more time than that to get out or to air the cave out. So they found that if they had the mouse and they put him from hand to hand, swap the mouse from one hand to the other, his heart rate would go up. He would take in more of the air, and then they would get a quicker notice of when they needed to escape the tunnel. Another animal they used in these tunnels, it got dark under there, and these engineers that came to be called the Manchester moles, M-O-L-E-S, the ones that were digging, because they had come from the mines there in Manchester, England. They didn't have electric lights when they first started. So they got the European glowworm, and they would put them in a bottle, and they would take them through, and they gave enough light for the men to see what they were doing and where they were going, what they needed to see. And that's the same thing really as our little fireflies that we have out there. But they used those in the trenches until lanterns came along. It got them through their work. The glowworm was also used at night in the trenches where they could read and write letters in the trenches and in those tunnels. This is a crater from that big one, that big one that I started talking about first that I shouldn't have, but I did. And you see the little man down here? That's a big crater. And what's happened to that is this man came along and he had someone that had been in World War I and heard the story of the great explosion. So he bought this property. All around it, and you can see, all around it, you can see their fields. And the aerial view, the aerial view is the hole that's left in a pretty perfectly level field. But he was felt closely akin to this crater, and he bought it, and you can go see it. So that's all the tidbits I have. How about questions or some comments for the movie, John?
Well, just a couple of things. Your presentation on the helmets.
I'm sorry.
About your presentation on the helmets.
Helmets,
Early, it reminded me of something I heard in a course I took years ago. When the British came out with steel helmets, the number of head injuries treated in the hospitals went up tremendously. And because they were surviving now.
Well, I think what you're saying, yeah, right. They had injuries, but the head injuries were lessened by like 70%.
Well,
But then there's the rest of them.
the ones that were killed, I mean, the ones that, a lot of them that were being treated now would have been killed before the steel helmet came. And our troops from America, what we used is British helmets in World War I. Because the U.S. Army didn't have steel helmets.
Wow, okay. Okay.
Another
Tidbit?
you talked about the Kaiser and the King of England being cousins. The Tsar of Russia was also a cousin.
Right, great family ties there. But that family thing did not keep us out of war. Any other comments? Yes, Rod?
You know, the style that two little things here.
Two little,
You know what that was? Oh, the style of it. You know, you have two little things sticking out of look like projections. You know what that was for? They would put out steel visor for the snipers so that they wouldn't get it, you know, wouldn't get shot in the front.
okay.
But it's over here, and you flip it over, okay, and that's it.
Did y'all hear that? Okay, there was a little steel visor in front of that helmet. I didn't see it in the picture. Steel plate, and he could flip it over so that the sniper couldn't get you in the forehead. And yeah, okay, wow. Questions or comments? Okay, one thing I will admit to being goofy. One of the first things I wanted to do when I started this morning, ask if we had any brand new people to OLLI in here today. Okay, what's your name, please? Yeah. I met Art. He came to Sunny Slope to register. He and his wife both. And Art, you're from Auburn. You're new to Auburn, newish to Auburn. So please meet Art. He's down here with Rod. Rod is not new. Oh, good. Okay. Are you the one responsible? You told me that too. Yeah. Well, I can forget things way too often. And okay. How about taking about a 5 or 6.5 minute break, and we'll have the first of the videos. I'm sorry? Oh, that was horrible, John. That was horrible. I don't know what I did wrong, but I sure did. Where's this book to?
Are you not going to be in the movie, or you can introduce it and be...
Oh, yeah, just about three little comments about the
Okay,
video.
just leave it on. It's off right now.
Okay.
No one can hear you.
Okay, good, thank you. I'll give it to you. Well, 9:05. See, I had planned those first three little. I wasn't going to do tunnelers today. When I did it at home, I got 20 minutes out of that. 20 to 25 minutes out of this first three. I don't. Whatever. Can't take it back. 9:06. It should be 9:20.
Yeah, well, if we start back by 9:20, you should get your 25 minutes.
Yeah, I don't want to give them 15 minutes break time though.
Yeah,
That's
well, it won't hurt to finish early. There might be questions.
right.
Discussion.
Well, I understand that. I can't argue with you. I'm just a little upset with myself. But okay,
It would,
can't go back. So.
I don't, if you hadn't told me, no one would have known to talk about 12
would.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, everyone, the video is about to begin. You can't have popcorn in here. They frown on that. I'm sorry. I was gonna bring some, but I couldn't. You believe that? Oh, am I on? Am I on? Yes. I'm not on here, so just ignore me. Do what? Oh, bring it up. Is that better? Oh, wow. You know, you want to blame it on somebody else. All righty, the movie's going to start. This man is from the University of Tennessee. He'll tell you about all his awards and stuff. I think you'll get into the information that he gives. I'm not going to say he dumbs it down, but he simplifies it enough without being overdone, and it flows beautifully. And I really got tickled with watching all those other videos we've had. I don't remember seeing an audience that was listening to the speaker, and it's much easier to talk, if you're being filmed, it's much easier to talk to people than it is just playing like people out there. So that was kind of nice. Is that important to y'all? Or never mind. Dr. Lucifius, and that's not the pronunciation, it's a hard name. He's going to talk to you first about nationalism. All these countries that eventually came into the war, some small, some large, once war broke out, once they realized they were going to war, it reminded me actually of Gone with the Wind, when somebody rode into the party and said, the Civil War said the war is broken out, long live the South, and waving their flags. And all the guys left the party and they jumped on their horses and they went to sign up. That's kind of what it reminds me of. Or after 9/11, where we were all flying flags, we were all wearing flags, we were America this and America that. Nationalism, that broke out all over Europe. The war's scale, he'll talk about that. 6,000 soldiers a day average dying. It's a lot of men. And how it affected, I had an old maid aunt, and she had a group of friends that had never married, and this was in the 50s and 60s. They had never married, and I said, well, you know, why didn't they marry? And Mother said, well, all the men were killed in the war. And they had a nice group of women. They had a real good time together. They just made the best out of it, and that just has stuck with me. You're going to hear a lot about brutalization with the new weapons coming out and the hand-to-hand combat. People kind of got down and dirty, and he'll talk about that. He's got a new, well, he's not a new, he brings in the phrase total war. It wasn't one of those wars where some army would march into a country and that part of the world was in turmoil. This was everybody everywhere. Not just the soldiers, but the families all over the world were involved. Food shortages, transportation problems, women going to work and the little children, everybody was involved in total war. He's going to talk about a new language. And I got really tickled. The expression over the top. You know, that class was over the top. Could be good or bad. Whatever, over the top. That came from this, and you're probably very familiar with that. But he brings out these new phrases, brings out phrases that originated with World War I. So listen for those too. He's going to he'll go over these and then give a quick synopsis of what's going to follow. So, if there are no further questions, then let's start the movie.
Your lecturer is Professor Vejas Gabriel Lulavicius. Dr. Lulavicius is the Lindsay Young Professor of History and Director of the Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He has won numerous awards for his teaching and scholarship. Among these are the University of Tennessee's Excellence in Teaching Award and a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship.
These lectures are titled World War I, The Great War, Part 1.
Welcome to this course on the First World War, the man-made catastrophe that launched the 20th century on its violent course, and indeed a key event of modern times. In this lecture, we'll begin by presenting the main themes of the course, beginning with the crucial concept of total war, as many historians consider the First World War the first example of this modern phenomenon. Total war is a phrase used to describe not merely a contest between professional armies on the battlefield, but rather represents something far vaster, a clash of entire societies mobilized for total victory, including their economies, their political establishments, the intellectual life of a society, all of the passions and feelings, emotions, and convictions of an entire population. Our other important themes will include the role that ideology and fervent beliefs had in determining the war's course and its conduct. Also, the meanings that were ascribed to the war as it was going on, as well as in its aftermath. And we'll examine here great contrasts in how the war was understood. As well, the shock of new experiences, a continual process of the shock of the new, and a steady process of brutalization. And finally, the implications of this great war for our civilization and for our own times. It's necessary thus to engage in a very difficult but nonetheless essential task of historical imagination, to seek to envision the war in its totality. This is in many ways a very difficult task that faces us. We're removed from the war by a distance of nearly a century. The war itself to contemporaries was of such a scale and of such novelty that they called it the Great War to express something of its all-encompassing nature. And then finally, another reason why it's difficult for us to envision the war in its totality is because that war has done so much to shape our modern world, as we'll see in coming lectures. One way, however, to begin the task of envisioning the experience of the war is to consider bookend scenes of that conflict, scenes accompanying its start as well as its end, that say much to us about the mixed nature of experiences in the First World War, some of its ambiguities and its diversity. In August of 1914, the war began, and it did so with a break at long last to tension that had gripped many Europeans. In August of 1914, with the declarations of war, that tension at last broke, and a remarkable emotional reaction set in. Vast cheering crowds throughout the capitals of Europe welcomed the war. In London, in Paris, in Berlin, in St. Petersburg, crowds gathered to sing national anthems, to wave national flags, to cheer, and to volunteer for the conflict. This event, this emotional reaction, came to be called the August Madness, and for many was an unforgettable experience. At the same time as you had these vast celebrations, however, there were also contrary phenomena, quiet leave-takings as soldiers left for the front, well aware that they might not return, individual foreboding, for not everyone cheered, not everyone celebrated, many understood the suffering that war would bring, if not ultimately its scale. And then finally, there's also the case of ethnic minorities in the multinational empires of Europe. The Poles, for instance, divided between three empires who well understood that it was not their national cause that they would be asked to sacrifice and die for, but rather that of a foreign regime. At the end of the war, 4 years later, in November of 1918, as the guns at last fell silent, as opposed to the tremendous celebration of 4 years previously, now quiet reigned. An unnatural stillness settled on the cemeteries and the battlefields that had been the site of the suffering of 4 years previous. At the same time, however, in a contrary phenomenon, elsewhere in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, there emerged new nations from the wreckage of empire, and crowds celebrated there the message of national rebirth and independence. These scenes, bookending the conflict, suggest something of its diversity and its complexity. Another challenge for us is to try to even take in the magnitude of the war's scale, one of the reasons why contemporaries called it the Great War. Mass armies were mobilized on a scale that simply had been unimaginable hitherto. An estimated 70 million soldiers participated in the war worldwide, and of them, over 9 million would be killed. To give some sense of this otherwise astronomical figure, one might mention that on average this works out to about 6,000 soldiers dying for every day of the war as it took its course. At the same time, we need to mention that even these astronomical figures lack a total precision. The precise number of deaths and casualties will likely never be known exactly, given the disorder and the lack of certainty about these figures that dominated at the end of the conflict. Another question which historians are still debating today is that of civilian casualties. Those numbers are not clear, but some estimates run to almost 6 million. A further key aspect of this war that we need to try to assimilate or take aboard is its identity as a world war. World war was a term used at the time as well to express the magnitude of this great war. Contemporaries obviously were not yet calling it the First World War. Even the most pessimistic couldn't expect that this would be the first in a series of conflicts. Nonetheless, the concept itself took on an important dimension. Earlier wars, such as the 7 Years' War of the 18th century, the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, had had a global dimension, but in some sense this war had an even more extended global aspect. And one reason for this was the extent of 19th century imperialism spreading the conflict around the globe. If our largest undertaking in this course is to try to take in some of the reality of this conflict in its totality, we want also to outline some of the aims of the course as we proceed. We'll be presenting not only a chronological narrative, and we certainly will be doing that as well, we'll also be combining this with a thematic approach, taking a moment now and again to really focus in on particular themes and topics of crucial importance. At the same time as we'll be covering military history, we'll also be seeking to include in our survey cultural, social, and political aspects of the conflict as well. We'll also be trying to present a narrative that's balanced between the different war fronts, rather than being, as is sometimes the case, almost exclusively focused on the more familiar and riveting scenes of the Western Front. We need now to outline some of the main themes of the course, and these are essentially 5. The first one concerns the totality of war, defining total war as a concept. Total war was a term that was coined and used during the war itself in an attempt to sum up what contemporaries felt was the all-encompassing nature of this modern industrial conflict. This new kind of war demanded total mobilization of mass armies, economies, societies, and the hearts and minds of people in the war, not merely soldiers on the battlefield. In this sense, this was not merely a war determined by government cabinets and elites, but in a very real sense, a people's war. And certain implications flowed from the totality of this new conflict. Increasingly, the stakes of total war were seen as total as well. Not merely an adjustment of competitive advantage as a result of battles or of territorial loss or gain, but total victory or total defeat would become the final outcome, not compromise. This long, grinding process of total war also would not bring quick victory, but the winner, in fact, would be the last one standing after a long, drawn-out process of attrition. Total war had other important implications as well. Because not only soldiers were involved, but also civilians took on a new importance. They too were mobilized to work for their country's victory on what came to be called the home front. This is a marvelously expressive phrase that really captures a key aspect of total war. And as a result of this new importance, civilians were increasingly the targets of violence as well. Very clearly, total war as a modern industrial conflict would also have a crucial economic dimension, as victory would not be found on the battlefield alone. And thus, economic weapons, like the naval blockade of the British of Germany to deny enemy resources, was an obvious tool. The enormous demands and strains of this phenomenon of total war would also tear at all of the societies engaged in the conflict. And these strains in society could take many different forms. Gaps could grow between the soldiers in the trenches, the civilians on the home front, with incomprehension growing between these parties, and alienation from the governments seeking to fight the war to a successful conclusion. All too often, social tensions could also lead to the search for scapegoats in minorities in one's own midst. Now, though the term total war was new and was used during the First World War itself, it actually really came into its own in popular usage after the war, as participants, contemporaries who had survived the conflict, tried to think out the implications of what they had lived through. And it's unfortunately a fact that the concept of total war in part came into its own because it was used by those who were already thinking about the next war and preparing for it, World War II. The experience of total war also affected political movements that in a sense arose out of the ruins of that conflict. These radical political movements were often called totalitarian because of their total claims upon people and societies. These included communism in Soviet Russia, fascism in Italy, and Nazism in Hitler's Germany. The ambitions of these movements, however different their ideologies were often rooted in the experience of the Great War. Their aims were to produce completely mobilized societies acting in unison and in ideological struggle. The second major theme that we'll be returning to over the course of this course is the neglected role of ideology. The First World War has often been depicted by historians as a conflict over geopolitics, the balance of power, and political issues, as opposed to the Second World War, which is seen as much more ideological, a complicated contest between democracies, Nazism, and the Soviet Union. In fact, this juxtaposition is overdrawn. Ideas and beliefs clearly played a crucial role throughout World War I and need to be understood. Some historians today are stressing this in their scholarship. They're urging us to conceptualize the context of the First World War as a distinct war culture, which developed over the course of the conflict, and which had a very serious ideological dimension. The eagerness with which the war was met, the eagerness which the war elicited, was afterwards, they argue, willfully forgotten in a narrative of disillusionment. Given such hopes and emotions from the very beginning of the war, what changes might follow? Our next major theme is that of the meanings assigned to the war. How is the war understood by those who participated in it and remembered it afterwards? It's crucial to acknowledge one central point. In the experience of contemporaries, we might say that there wasn't merely one First World War, but rather a multiplicity of wars. And this is something we'll be returning to in our lectures. The war on the Western Front was very different from that of the Eastern Front or the other fronts, and thus all of these different experiences need to be taken into account. Western memory of the Great War is very different from that is dominant in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. The memory of Western Europeans of the Great War tended to focus in the decades after that conflict on senseless sacrifice, on the bloody extinction of an entire generation of youth. For what? By contrast, a very different set of meanings were assigned to the Great War in Eastern Europe in its aftermath. In newly independent nation states, by contrast, in Eastern Europe, The Great War was seen not as senseless or meaningless, but instead as the very exemplar of a purposeful event, producing national independence in a baptism of fire. And likewise, in a related and paradoxical reversal, some of these contrasts reverberate later in the 20th century. In Western Europe, World War II is often regarded as the good war. The perspective in Eastern Europe on the Second World War is much more ambivalent. By contrast, there, Nazi rule was replaced by decades of communist control, and the narrative is not simply one of liberation. The next major theme is the process of repeated shocks of new experiences that needed to be assimilated or taken aboard, culminating in an overall and prolonged process of brutalization. The war presented an unceasing series of novelties that unfortunately later became increasingly ordinary and feature in our own times. These included the use of vast new technologically sophisticated weapons systems, including tanks, airplanes, as well as a dreadful weapon, poison gas. These included new approaches to war that targeted civilians. They included also the devastating modern phenomenon of genocide, including the Armenian massacres in the Ottoman Empire that we'll be discussing in a later lecture. It also expanded the powers of the state and created new strategies for dealing with populations in what came to be called population policy. Ultimately, though extremely difficult to measure, many contemporaries, especially the more sensitive and thoughtful ones, felt that they were living through a process of brutalization in which the sensibilities of ordinary individuals as well as societies were, in a sense, hardening, and the value of human life was being altered and downgraded. The war, thus, functioned as a hinge of violence in modern history, preparing greater horrors to come. Our last major theme of the course are the implications of the Great War in the largest sense, because the First World War has left its mark on us in this day in ways both small as well as large. Its traces, indeed, are to be found in our language today. These include phrases that we utter perhaps in the workplace about going into the trenches or fighting, slogging it out in the trenches. Another phrase is that of a no man's land, which crops up in our everyday language as well, which originally designated those territories located between the trench lines, which represented the central area of combat. And then a phrase also harking back to the First World War, the phrase going over the top, which represented, in fact, the notion of a frontal attack of troops leaping up out of the trenches, heading out across no man's land in order to engage in, it was hoped, a victorious assault on the enemy side. These are traces left in our language. Other objects that to us are quite ordinary also are rooted in the experience of the First World War. These include mundane objects like wristwatches. Indeed, in the 19th century, a proper gentleman would wear a pocket watch rather than a wristwatch. But in the trenches of the First World War, the use of wristwatches in order to readily coordinate attacks going over the top at a precisely predetermined and planned time produced the popularity of the wristwatch, replacing pocket watches. Even trench coats, still worn today, are very much artifacts of that time and that place. An ordinary phenomenon that we experience twice a year, that of daylight savings time, the transition in how we lead our lives on an ordinary schedule, harkens back to the First World War. As nations mobilizing for total conflict, the state would determine when it was necessary to change our experience of time itself in order to prolong the working day. At the most significant level, the war also led to changes of really profound nature in the status of the state, that's to say the government, and the powers that it was willing to claim and that individuals were willing to accept as claims. Status of society changed as well in the calls that it could make on individuals. And then also the status of the individual himself or herself changed as a result of this vast conflict as well. Indeed, some historians have argued on a very profound level that even our language changed. And we'll be discussing in later lectures this remarkable and provocative thesis that the English language itself, among others, changed in the way certain words operated. The argument gets made that after the searing disillusionment of the First World War, the words honor and duty, for instance, could never be spoken again without an element of irony. This is a claim that we'll be examining in a later lecture. At the same time, paradoxically, one of the outcomes of the First World War, and even of this alleged process of disillusionment, was not a loss of faith, but a renewed and even more explosive political faith, the production of fierce new ideological politics in a new age of belief. The decades that followed the First World War were ones of extreme politics, with ideological choices in which individuals were not afforded the right to any kind of neutrality, but instead would have to make choices between opposed ideologies. The growth of this extremism across the political spectrum ultimately culminated in a repetition of the phenomenon of total war in the Second World War. And the linkages between these two global conflicts are made clear in a very ordinary way in some of the figures whom we'll encounter in the course of our lectures who played roles in both the First World War and later in the Second World War. These include the British politician and later leader Winston Churchill. They include the young officer during the First World War, Charles de Gaulle, who would later rally the French resistance cause. They include an ordinary soldier who would later become the dictator of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, as well as another future dictator, Benito Mussolini, and many others. The linkages between these two world wars are such that historians have begun to provocatively suggest that it may very well be that we need to think not only of separate conflicts, but rather of an extended continuum of conflict, of clash, that we might need to think about as a 30 years war of the 20th century rather than as distinct conflicts. And it's likely to be the case that as we recede in time from the experience of both world wars, from the perspective of those who come later, these events will draw closer and closer, and the perspective will be altered for people in the future. What was clearly recognized by contemporaries was that the First World War and then later the Second World War seemingly normalized a massive brutalization of our shared civilization. In a famous phrase still echoed by historians as nearly obligatory, the American diplomat and historian George Kennan described the First World War as the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. And what he meant by that was that the First World War had unleashed a whole series of processes and dynamics that ultimately would set the 20th century on its destructive course. In many ways, as we'll be exploring in our course, the First World War has shaped the world we know today. Many of its political borders, its regional conflicts, many of the perils, nightmares, and hopes that are with us still. We'd like to briefly provide an overview of the individual lectures to see the trajectory that our course will be taking. In our first 6 lectures, we will be examining the outbreak of the war after having provided an overview of the context in which Europe and the world found itself in 1914 and immediately before. We will have examined a crisis in politics and culture. We'll examine a still very lively debate about the causes of the war, and we'll take a much closer look at this riveting mass psychological phenomenon of the August Madness of 1914, immediately before an unexpected breakdown in the war plans, which were to bring, it was hoped, a quick victory to the fighting sides. In our following 3 lectures, we'll examine the Western Front, which has such an iconic and clearly very important status as a site of modernity for our own times. We'll examine the experience of what it was like to live and die in the trenches. We'll examine the titanic battles that were fought on the Western Front and which brought so little in terms of victory. We'll then shift our attention to view other fronts and other dimensions of the war's experience. We'll examine what has been called the unknown war on the Eastern Front. We'll examine the Southern fronts and the Mediterranean as another crucial area of operations. Our course then will turn, for our next 4 lectures, for an extended and careful look at particular themes that span the fighting fronts as well as chronological scope. We'll examine the war aims of the fighting powers, what it was that they were willing to state that they were fighting for. And we'll also examine the experience bound up in war aims of occupations and its attempts to seize territory. We'll examine as well soldiers in their identity not merely as fighters, but also as victims. The dimensions of violence in the battlefield, what it meant physically, as well as the experience that many soldiers shared in of captivity, of being prisoners. We'll examine reactions to the war and its experience at the battlefront in the form of stormtroopers, soldiers who exulted in the experience of war, and future dictators, Hitler and Mussolini. We then will examine also the total war of technology and trace a remarkable process of ever-accelerating advances in technological change with ever more destructive potential realized. Our next lectures will turn to examine other theaters of the war in the air and the war at sea, as well as a lecture devoted entirely to the global reach and the scope of the war. Our next 5 lectures then will turn to examine the experience of the war at home, what it meant for governments, societies, and individuals as they mobilized for the conflict itself. We'll examine the invention of the wartime state as vast new powers accrued to governments mobilizing populations and economies for all-out victory. We'll examine the remarkable and increasing sophistication of propaganda, the attempt to motivate societies' hearts and minds for endurance as well as victory in the war. We'll then examine more closely the experience of endurance and the stress that was very much a part of the experience of the home fronts. We'll examine the possibilities for dissent against the war and the limits placed upon it. And then in a special lecture, we'll look more closely at the remarkable challenge that essentially the midpoint of the war represented in terms of a renewed tensing of energies and a mustering of will to continue the fight from 1916 to 1917 on. Our next lectures will be devoted then to examining some of the destructive consequences of the strains of total war. We'll devote a lecture to look more closely at how the First World War provided the context for an act of modern genocide, the massacres against the Armenians in 1915 in the Ottoman Empire. A program of population policy tipped over into genocide. That's to say, the killing of a group of people, not because of what they've done, but rather because of who they are and what they represent to those committing this crime. We'll examine also the plethora of social and national revolts that erupted as a result of the strains of war, especially felt keenly by multinational empires unable to mobilize effectively for the conflict itself. Our next lectures then will turn to 2 world historical events that take place in 1917 and that truly, as we've already suggested earlier in this lecture, in some sense reverberate through the rest of the 20th century. In 1917, the Russian revolutions break out, and the United States enters the war with remarkable and important results. We'll examine the complicated course of revolutionary events within Russia itself in 1917, with successive changes of revolutionary regimes culminating in the coming to power of Lenin and the Bolsheviks announcing a new world order on the lines of their communist ideology. We'll also examine the other paired world historical event of 1917, America's entry into the war, also with an announced ideological goal of reshaping the world order, and with a very keen and important ideological charge. We'll examine in detail not only the reasons for America's entry into the war, but also the experience of Americans in the war over there, across the Atlantic, as well as in wartime America at home. We'll then examine the remarkable and quick series of events in 1918 which brought an end to the wartime efforts of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. We'll examine the emotions that attended the ending of the war in 1918, the collapse of empires with remarkable rapidity, and the achievement of national independence by many independent states in Eastern Europe. We will bring our course to a close by examining attempts at peacemaking, in particular the Versailles Treaty and the Paris Settlement, as well as the aftershocks that followed the war, which didn't have a neat end, but instead continued in a very real sense for years afterwards. We'll examine also the echoes of the war in the form of monuments, memory, myth, as well as conspiracy theories about the war and its meaning, and as a result of the tremendous experiences and devastation of the First World War, the beginning of the rise of mass dictatorships, which would have everything to do with the unleashing of the Second World War. In our very last lecture, we'll examine the legacies of the Great War and indicate not only how it changed the course of modern history, but how it continues to affect us to this very day.
One little thing to add, is that too long? He was talking about how it disrupted families, civilians. One of the, okay, just go back. I had found a book I had wanted my husband to order for me on Amazon about World War I. Well, this book comes in, and the next day another book comes in, and the next day another book, and like, you know, these big books. And I don't retain like some people do, so it really took a lot of digging to find some of this. But one of the whole books I read was about the children of war. These boys, age 14 in Britain, signed up when the war broke out. Now, they weren't supposed to, but there was no big home front standing army. The armies were in the provinces. Britain depended on its navy. So lots of men were signing up, but the 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds that signed up were quite numerous. Some of them were out of orphanages, had kind of nothing else to do, no future to look for, so you can kind of see that. Others were kind of, if you say troublemakers, they just said, well, go on. The mom and daddy said, well, just, you know, go on. You've probably felt that at some point in your parenthood, too. And some boys would just kind of leave in the middle of the night and go sign up. The people that were recruiting them, they would walk down the street and they'd see a young man who looked like he might be of age to go to the army. And they would point him out and say, what are you doing? Why are you wandering the streets? We could use you. And they would guilt them into signing up. So it was some of the recruiters, some of the on the boys' part, and then they had to go through a physical too. And even the doctors were in on it, unless it was really extreme. You get one of these young, small kids who absolutely looked his age, and there was a measurement they took of the child to see if he would have the stamina to go through the process of training, much less going overseas. They weren't supposed to send anyone, the Brits weren't supposed to send anyone overseas unless they were 19. Birth certificates weren't asked for. Now, if you found that your child, that your son had gone to sign up, you could bring their birth certificate, write a letter, and it might be somewhere in the process they could get this boy and bring him home. But what happened to him when he got home? the other boys had gone, so many of the other boys had gone home, he would have, again, been guilted into being at home and have this problem with his mom and daddy having done that to him. In the first years of the war, they did bring a lot of them back to England, and they kind of kept them together because they had experienced things that other boys their age hadn't, and tried to kind of get them back to some sort of normalcy. But they had seen things that other boys could not imagine. So that's one way it affected family life and the young men. Okay, Frank?
Well, also, it was very common later in the war for English women to hand men with, in civilian clothing, white feathers. So they would walk up to men in the street, and if the man was not in uniform, they would hand that gentleman a white feather, indicating that he should be at the front.
Okay, men that weren't fighting, that looked like they were capable of going to the war, some of the women around there took affront at that because their husbands, their daddies, their brothers had gone to the war, and this man hasn't. So they would hand him a white feather, which probably made him feel pretty rotten. We don't know what his job would have been. It might have been some critical job that he had too, but that didn't matter. He looked like he should be over there. Any other comments? Maggie?
What year did the war start?
1914. 19. It's like that song, 1914, we took a little trip. I don't even smile out there. I'm not going to sing anymore. Jim?
1914.
I know, I just changed it a little bit. Yeah. Bill, real quick.
This war that you're talking about, World War I is supposed to be the war to end all wars, but yet across the world earlier is supposed to be the weapon to end all wars. And then I think we have to look at it through technology. The technology advances from World War I to World War II to Korea and then to Afghanistan. But I think that this PTSD is the same thing as what he was talking about in World War I.
Exactly. Exactly. And he'll cover all those things. It was the war to end all wars, and it's kind of more the war that started wars. Jim?
One of the phrases of World War I that still lingers. You can't keep them down on the farm after they've seen Barry.
That's okay. And I'm not going to sing that, but if you'd like to join me, that's how you going to keep them down on the farm. Okay. I hope there are no more comments because I'm going to let you go, and hope we see you again next week. We'll have some films. I think I'll have one, and Ned has the second. And have a good week. Thank you for being here. Should I? I'll use my friend here. Because I needed two. All right.
See how
Yeah, now you gotta have his performance. Let's see. I'm trying to decide. Do it on the right side. Alrighty, and make sure it stays high up here because that's how people can hear you. When
Up
it's
here.
quiet is because someone puts it down low. Okay, you just put this in
Okay.
your back pocket. And do you have someone doing announcements for you?
I'm sorry?
Do you have someone doing announcements for you?
Yeah, there would be a person introducing me, and then I'll take over and I'll do the announcement and begin the rest.
Okay. So when the person introduces you,
Yeah.
your microphone is going to go live as well. So when they're introducing you, make sure you stay quiet because otherwise they'll just hear you chatting.
I understand. Okay.
And
Now the person who's going to introduce me, you need to see him?
yes, that would be great.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Probably going out.
Well, what's his name? I'll just catch him when he comes in.
Yeah. Art call.
All right. I'll get him a mic as soon as I see him.
Okay.
And besides
So
that, do you need anything else? Your clicker is up there on the podium.
the pointer. The
Yeah.
support. Okay.
It's good to go.
Okay.
Are you okay?
All right. I think so.
Okay, you just let me know.
There you go over there.
Oh, yeah. I can't, I normally work in the cookout. I'm going to be out of town that weekend.
Donde quiera. The sound in the first two is messed up a little for me, but not, probably not for you. Okay. Okay.
You remember Kyle Frazier?
Well, I'm thinking,
You got name tags that were in the folder, Emily?
I haven't opened the folder.
Okay.
There you go. There you go. Good to see you. Good to see you. I always come.
Did you find out about the little known secret?
No secret.
After your class at lunchtime, you open that door and there's a microwave in there, and she said we could use it.
That's pretty
You
good.
warm your coffee, warm up your food.
Good to see.
Did you see him out there working in the cotton patch with that machine? I said, I bet that you told them to get busy for our class.
They wouldn't let me. They, brought it. Had to bring a cotton plant here. Prohibited. You cannot bring that material here because these may have bugs, and the bugs get in the wall, and they eat up the paintings.
Well, you'll have to leave it outside and we'll go look.
Oh, I got it. We got it. Next week we're going to be visiting there. We're going to get intimate with cotton in there.
I just want to mention that I've got a doctor's appointment at 11, and so I'm going to have to leave early, so don't...
Don't worry about it. Okay. Men.